Right now, while you're watching this, a country is tearing itself apart, and the world has gone silent. Sudan, a nation of over 45 million people, is engulfed in a catastrophic conflict that most people know nothing about. Cities are burning, civilians are starving, and two military forces are locked in a brutal power struggle that's created the world's largest displacement crisis. This isn't just another distant war. This is a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. And what's happening in Sudan should concern every single one of us. Because the patterns we're seeing here, the collapse of order, the fight for resources, the regional instability, these are warning signs for conflicts that could shape our entire future. Let me take you back to where this all started. Sudan has always been strategically important. It's the third largest country in Africa, sitting at the crossroads between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, between the Arab world and the African continent. For decades, it was ruled by Omar al-Bashir, a military dictator who came to power in a coup in 1989. His rule was marked by violence, corruption, and authoritarian control. Under his watch, Sudan became isolated internationally, facing sanctions and accusations of genocide, particularly for the atrocities committed in Darfur starting in 2003. But in 2019, something remarkable happened. The Sudanese people rose up. Massive protests swept through the capital, Khartoum, and other cities. People took to the streets demanding freedom, justice, and an end to military rule. They chanted, they organized, they refused to back down. And after months of sustained pressure, the unthinkable occurred. Omar al-Bashir was ousted. The military removed him from power in April 2019. For a moment, there was hope. Real hope. The protest movement, led largely by young people, professionals, and women, seemed to have achieved the impossible. They'd toppled a dictator who had ruled for 3 decades. But here's where things get complicated. The military didn't just hand over power to civilians. Instead, a fragile power-sharing agreement was established. A transitional government was formed, meant to guide Sudan toward democratic elections. It included both civilian leaders and military figures. This was supposed to be a bridge to democracy. The two most powerful military figures in this arrangement were Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who led the Sudanese armed forces, known as the SAF, and Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemedti, who commanded the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Now, the RSF wasn't just another military unit. It had evolved from the Janjaweed militias, the same forces accused of genocide in Darfur. The RSF was essentially a paramilitary force, heavily armed, operating with significant autonomy, and deeply involved in Sudan's economy, particularly gold mining. So you had these two powerful military leaders, both with their own forces, both with their own interests, supposedly working together to transition Sudan to civilian rule. From the start, tensions simmered. Al-Burhan represented the traditional military establishment. Hemedti represented a newer, more entrepreneurial form of military power, built on resource extraction and paramilitary operations. They were rivals forced into partnership. In October 2021, the fragile arrangement collapsed. Al-Burhan and Hemedti staged a coup together, dissolving the transitional government and arresting civilian leaders. The international community condemned it. Protests erupted again, but the military consolidated control. For a while, it seemed like Al-Burhan and Hemedti would continue their uneasy alliance, ruling Sudan together through military might. But power sharing between rivals never lasts. The fundamental question became, who would ultimately control Sudan? The tensions between the SAF and the RSF grew. There were disagreements about integrating the RSF into the regular armed forces. There were disputes about economic interests. And there was the simple, brutal calculus of power. Both leaders knew that only one could ultimately be in charge. On April 15, 2023, the violence exploded. Fighting broke out in Khartoum between the SAF and the RSF. What started as skirmishes rapidly escalated into full-scale urban warfare. Tanks rolled through residential neighborhoods. Artillery shells crashed into hospitals and homes. Machine gun fire echoed through the streets. The capital descended into chaos. Within days, the fighting spread beyond Khartoum. It engulfed other cities. Darfur, that region that had already suffered so much, became a major battleground once again. The violence there took on horrific dimensions, with ethnic targeting and mass atrocities. The conflict wasn't just military versus military anymore. It became entangled with local grievances, ethnic tensions, and resource competition. Let me paint a picture of what this means on the ground. Imagine living in Khartoum, a city of over 5 million people. You wake up to the sound of explosions. You can't go to work because the streets are battlegrounds. The water supply is cut. Electricity is sporadic at best. Food is running out in the markets. Banks are closed. Hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties, running out of medical supplies, sometimes caught in crossfire themselves. You're trapped in your home, not knowing if a shell will hit your building. You hear gunfire constantly. You see smoke rising from different parts of the city. Your children are terrified, and you have no idea when or how this will end. That's the reality for millions of Sudanese people right now. And here's the truly devastating part. This conflict has created the world's largest displacement crisis. More than 10 million people have been forced from their homes. Think about that number. 10 million human beings, each with families, dreams, memories, forced to flee. Some have moved to other parts of Sudan, crowding into areas that can't support them, straining already limited resources. Others have crossed borders into neighboring countries like Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia. These countries, many of them struggling with their own challenges, are now hosting hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees. The humanitarian situation is catastrophic. According to the United Nations, more than 24 million people in Sudan need humanitarian assistance. That's over half the population. Famine conditions exist in multiple areas. Children are dying of malnutrition. Disease is spreading in displacement camps where sanitation is inadequate. Healthcare systems have collapsed. Schools are closed. The economy is in free fall. And the violence itself is unspeakable. Both the SAF and RSF have been accused of serious human rights violations. There are documented cases of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. Civilian areas are deliberately targeted. Humanitarian workers are attacked. Ethnic violence, particularly in Darfur, has reached genocidal levels again, with the RSF and allied Arab militias targeting non-Arab communities. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond Sudan's borders. First, there's the regional instability. Sudan shares borders with 7 countries. When Sudan destabilizes, it affects the entire region. Refugee flows strain neighboring nations. Armed groups operate across borders. Regional rivalries get played out through proxy involvement in Sudan's conflict. And speaking of proxies, multiple external actors have interests in Sudan. The United Arab Emirates has been accused of supporting the RSF, allegedly providing weapons and support. Egypt backs the SAF, viewing it as the legitimate military institution and worrying about instability on its southern border. Russia, through the Wagner Group and now other entities, has interests in Sudan's gold resources and strategic Red Sea access. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states have economic and political interests. This isn't just a Sudanese conflict. It's become a proxy battleground for regional and international powers. From a United States perspective, Sudan matters for several reasons. First, humanitarian concerns. America has historically been a leader in humanitarian response, and the scale of suffering in Sudan demands attention. Second, counterterrorism interests. Sudan has been a theater for terrorist groups in the past, and state collapse creates spaces where such groups can operate. Third, great power competition. If the United States disengages, other powers fill the vacuum, potentially contrary to American interests. Fourth, the principle of preventing atrocities. The international community, led partly by the United States, established norms about preventing genocide and mass atrocities. What's happening in Darfur tests those commitments. Let me address the military dimensions more specifically. The Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, are the official military of Sudan. They have heavier weaponry, including aircraft, artillery, and armor. They control some key infrastructure and have international recognition as the legitimate military force. But they're not necessarily more effective. The war has revealed weaknesses in command, control, logistics, and morale. The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, are more mobile, more decentralized, and frankly more ruthless. They've proven effective in urban combat and guerrilla-style operations. They control significant economic resources, particularly gold mines, which help fund their operations. They've also been effective at recruiting, often from marginalized communities, offering money and status to fighters. Neither side has achieved decisive military victory, and that's part of the tragedy. This conflict grinds on because it's essentially a stalemate. Both sides can inflict damage, but neither can fully defeat the other. And in stalemate, civilians suffer most. Multiple ceasefire attempts have failed. International mediation efforts, led by various actors including the African Union, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, have produced temporary pauses at best. Both the SAF and RSF have violated agreements. Humanitarian corridors that are negotiated get blocked or attacked. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Announce a ceasefire, brief reduction in fighting, violations begin, full-scale combat resumes. Why do ceasefires fail? Because neither side believes they can achieve their goals through negotiation. Al-Burhan sees himself as the legitimate leader defending Sudan's military institutions. Hemedti sees himself as a revolutionary figure challenging an old, corrupt establishment. Both have committed atrocities that make peaceful coexistence difficult. Both fear what happens if they lose. Both believe military victory is possible if they just keep fighting. The economic destruction is staggering. Sudan's economy, already weak before the conflict, has collapsed. The Sudanese pound has lost most of its value. Inflation is astronomical. Trade has stopped. Infrastructure is destroyed. Oil production, one of Sudan's few significant economic activities after South Sudan's independence, is disrupted. The country is becoming poorer by the day, which means even if peace comes tomorrow, recovery will take years, probably decades. Let's talk about the human stories, because numbers alone don't capture the reality. There's the story of doctors in Khartoum performing surgery by flashlight when power goes out during shelling. There's the story of teachers in displacement camps trying to educate children under trees because there are no school buildings. There's the story of mothers walking for days with small children to reach refugee camps in Chad, arriving exhausted and traumatized. There's the story of young men, from both sides, recruited or forced to fight, killing and dying in a war most of them don't fully understand. Women and girls face particular horrors. Sexual violence is rampant and systematic. The RSF especially has been accused of using rape as a weapon of terror. Women in displacement camps face constant threat. Pregnant women can't access health care. Girls' education, already limited in many parts of Sudan, has completely stopped. The international response has been inadequate. Yes, humanitarian agencies are working heroically, delivering aid where they can, treating the wounded, feeding the hungry. But the funding is insufficient. The access is restricted. And the political will to actually stop the fighting is absent. The United Nations Security Council is divided, with some members blocking strong action. The African Union lacks the resources and leverage to enforce peace. Western nations are distracted by other crises and wary of deep engagement. From a United States military and strategic perspective, there are lessons here. First, the danger of empowering military forces without civilian oversight. The United States has trained and equipped various Sudanese military units over the years, including some RSF elements for counterterrorism operations. Those resources are now being used in a civil war. Second, the complexity of transition from authoritarianism. The 2019 revolution showed that toppling a dictator is one thing, building stable democratic institutions is far harder, especially when military forces retain power. Third, the importance of sustained engagement. The United States and international community engaged intensely during the transition period, then attention waned and the situation collapsed. There's also a broader pattern visible in Sudan that we're seeing elsewhere. When state institutions fail, when military forces fracture, when resources are scarce and grievances are many, violence can erupt with shocking speed and brutality. We saw it in Syria, in Libya, and Yemen. Sudan is another data point in understanding how states collapse and how conflicts become entrenched. What about potential paths forward? Realistically, several scenarios exist, none of them particularly hopeful in the near term. One scenario is continued stalemate, with fighting dragging on for years, the country fragmenting, different regions controlled by different forces, becoming essentially a failed state. Another scenario is eventual military victory by one side, probably through exhaustion of the other, followed by authoritarian rule and likely revenge against the losing side and its supporters. A third scenario, far less likely but possible, is a negotiated settlement brokered by international mediators with real leverage, leading to a new transitional arrangement, demilitarization of politics, and gradual movement toward stability. The challenge with the third scenario is that it requires both parties to believe they benefit more from peace than continued war. Right now, both leaderships believe they can win, or at least that they can't afford to lose. Changing that calculation requires either battlefield realities that make victory impossible, or international pressure that makes continued fighting too costly. International pressure could take several forms. Sanctions targeting leaders and their financial networks. Arms embargoes actually enforced, cutting off weapons supplies. Criminal accountability through the International Criminal Court, which already has jurisdiction in Sudan for previous atrocities. Diplomatic isolation. Financial pressure on the banks and networks that fund the fighting. But all of this requires coordinated international action, which has been lacking. There's also the question of justice. Both sides have committed atrocities. Thousands of civilians have been killed. Sexual violence has been widespread. Communities have been destroyed. At some point, if peace comes, what happens? Is there accountability? Truth and reconciliation? Amnesty for fighters? These are not easy questions, but they're crucial for any sustainable peace. Let me bring this back to why Americans should care. Some might ask, why should the United States involve itself in Sudan? We have our own problems. We can't solve every conflict in the world. Those are legitimate questions, but here's the counter-argument. First, humanitarian grounds. The scale of suffering is immense, and America has the resources to help, to save lives, to prevent starvation and disease. Second, strategic interests. Sudan sits in a crucial region. Its stability or instability affects counterterrorism, migration, regional security, and great power competition. Third, moral leadership. If America and its allies don't stand against atrocities, against the use of sexual violence as a weapon, against the targeting of civilians, then who does? The norms we've built about human rights and preventing genocide either mean something or they don't. There's also a practical dimension. Conflicts like Sudan's don't stay contained. They spill over. They create refugee flows that destabilize regions. They create opportunities for terrorist groups. They invite intervention by actors hostile to American interests. Engagement doesn't necessarily mean military intervention, but it does mean sustained diplomatic effort, humanitarian support, and willingness to use leverage. Looking at this through a military lens, what could the United States military contribute? Direct combat involvement is highly unlikely and probably unwise. But there are other options. Intelligence sharing with humanitarian organizations about safe routes and dangerous areas. Logistical support for aid delivery. Pressure through military-to-military channels on actors who have influence with the SAF or RSF. Support for African Union or UN peacekeeping if a ceasefire ever holds. Training and support for eventual security sector reform if peace comes. These are roles the US military has played in other conflicts. The Sudanese people themselves are the ones who will ultimately determine their country's future. The protest movement that brought down al-Bashir, though suppressed, still exists. Civil society, despite the violence, continues to function in pockets. Neighborhood committees in Khartoum have organized to provide services and protection when state authority vanished. Teachers keep teaching. Doctors keep healing. There's resilience and dignity in the face of unimaginable hardship. One of the most frustrating aspects is how little attention this crisis receives. It's been called a forgotten war. Media coverage is limited. Public awareness is low. Compare the international response to Sudan with responses to other crises, and the disparity is obvious. Why? Partly because journalists struggle to access the conflict zone safely. Partly because Sudan lacks the geopolitical prominence of some other conflicts. Partly because, let's be honest, crises in Africa often receive less attention than those in Europe or the Middle East. This disparity isn't just unfortunate, it's unjust. The role of technology in this conflict is interesting. Both sides use social media for propaganda. Atrocities are documented on cell phones and shared online. Misinformation spreads rapidly. The RSF especially has been effective at using social media to recruit and spread their narrative. At the same time, journalists and activists use these same tools to get information out, to document abuses, to maintain international awareness. The conflict has also disrupted Sudan's relationship with its neighbors in complex ways. Chad has received hundreds of thousands of refugees while dealing with its own instability. Egypt supports the SAF but worries about refugee flows and instability affecting the Nile waters. South Sudan, itself emerging from civil war, now hosts Sudanese refugees while some South Sudanese refugees in Sudan are displaced again. Ethiopia, dealing with its own internal conflicts, has Sudanese refugees while its own situation affects Sudan. The region is interconnected, and instability in one country ripples through all. There are also environmental dimensions. Fighting disrupts agriculture, threatening food security. Displacement puts pressure on resources in host areas. The conflict is happening in a region already stressed by climate change, by desertification, by water scarcity. These environmental factors both contribute to conflict and are worsened by it. Let's talk about the children of Sudan. An entire generation is growing up in war. Children who should be in school are in refugee camps. Children who should be playing are witnessing violence. Children who should be safe are starving. The psychological trauma will last lifetimes. The lost education will affect Sudan's development for decades. Some children are recruited as fighters, their childhoods stolen. This is not just a current crisis, it's creating a legacy of pain that will shape Sudan's future. The international architecture meant to prevent such crises has failed in Sudan. The United Nations, designed to maintain international peace and security, has been unable to stop the fighting. The International Criminal Court, meant to deter atrocities, has issued warrants but no one is arrested. The norms about responsibility to protect civilians are exposed as hollow when political will is absent. Sudan is a test case and we're failing it. What can individuals do? First, stay informed. Follow reputable news sources covering Sudan. Second, support humanitarian organizations working there. Doctors Without Borders, the International Rescue Committee, UNICEF, and others need funding to deliver aid. Third, contact political representatives. Public pressure can influence policy. Fourth, amplify Sudanese voices. Share their stories, their perspectives, their humanity. Don't let this be a forgotten crisis. For those in the United States military community watching this, there are specific takeaways. Study how military forces can become threats to the very nations they're meant to protect. Understand how resource control, especially of valuable commodities like gold, can fund and perpetuate conflict. Recognize how external support to military forces can have unintended consequences. Learn from the failures of transition processes and what's needed for successful civil-military relations in fragile states. The situation in Sudan is still evolving. As of now, in January 2026, the fighting continues. Attempts at negotiation sputter along. The humanitarian crisis deepens. More people are displaced. More suffer. But the story isn't over. What happens next depends on choices made in Khartoum, in regional capitals, in international forums, and yes, in Washington. This is not a distant, irrelevant conflict. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, a regional crisis, a test of international principles, and a warning about patterns we're seeing globally. The people of Sudan deserve better than what they're experiencing. They deserve peace, justice, and the opportunity to build the democratic future they fought for in 2019. What's happening in Sudan matters because human suffering matters. It matters because instability in one region affects us all. It matters because the choices we make about engagement and leadership define who we are. It matters because if we turn away from this, we're saying that some lives matter less than others. And that's a principle we should never accept. The story of Sudan is ongoing. It's a story of tremendous suffering, but also of remarkable resilience. It's a story of military ambition destroying a nation, but also of ordinary people maintaining their humanity in the face of horror. It's a story that should shame the international community, but could still have a better ending if we find the will to act. What's happening in Sudan is a crisis, but it's also a choice. We can choose to pay attention, to care, to help, or we can choose to look away. And that choice reveals who we are.